Welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Austin Chadwick, co-host is Chris Lucian. And today we're glad to have Scott Bellware with us to hit through some great topics. So the topics we're looking to get to are, kind of a good example of mobbing versus a bad example of mobbing that Scott has experienced, maybe dark mobbing. Maybe we'll get to counterintuitive agility and extreme programming, and then maybe round it out with lean pursuing perfection. But before jumping to those topics, Scott, do you mind giving us a little introduction about yourself?
I'm Scott Bellware, been in software for so long now that it's almost an embarrassment to say how long it's been. I've done everything in software from line level development all the way through to CTO, with everything in between, including stints in usability, UX design, software testing, program management, you name it, everything except operations. I spent a year and a half working at Rackspace to learn more about operations, and spent all that time remediating enterprise software rather than learning anything about how data centers work. So there you go.
Nice. Right on. And so I think the way our conversation started on social media was you had an example where maybe mobbing didn't go so great, and then you also had some examples where it went better. So maybe kind of like a mad, sad, glad retro. We'll start, on the sadder side, and then maybe go towards the better experiences. So maybe tell us about the mobbing experience that wasn't so great. Yeah.
It's something, and it's something that might be limited to the consulting space, or the way mobbing is used in consulting. And things tend to, in that world, we can get a lot of hogwash that's foisted upon companies and developers, especially enterprise companies, especially traditional bureaucratic, big enterprise shops that struggle for many reasons. So what I saw in that space was this leveraging of mobbing that was, well, I can just explain it to you. Get a team in a room, have one person on the keyboard and the mouse, writing the code, working the editor. Everybody else's audience, we'll swap people in from the observer pool into the keyboard controller, first the pilot in command role. And then one other person dictating to the person at the keyboard exactly what to type on the keyboard and what to work in the mouse and what files to open. I am shocked to think what would happen if this version of mobbing was one that caught on. And I saw it being done at a major financial institution, a name that you guys would all know, on multiple teams, with a big agile consultancy doing this. And I'm a consultant myself, or a contractor myself, and I understand the revenue model and the things that can be done in that space to sort of maybe slow down the work and maybe increase billable hours. Maybe it's something like that, and I'm cynical enough to believe that that's exactly what's happening in that space. But I know that this is being done by at least, well, there's more than one very large or very well-known agile consultancy at very large legacy companies, and that ultimately means that this is something that is been exposed, that hundreds of developers are being exposed to. So I when I think of that, I kind of think, God forbid that it becomes viral, that it becomes the definition of mobbing. And on the other hand, the best case scenario for mobbing, in my book, is basically what we were already doing with extreme programming 20 years ago, and what we were doing before that, because the X people just didn't introduce the idea of collaborating with our coworkers. It did introduce a little bit more rigor around it, and some practices, some exercises, but it's something we were always doing, and something that we do based on need. sort of based on need. I mean, you guys probably have some background in XP yourselves, I imagine. So there was that period where, XP was young and new, and we are trying to like almost do experiments or do learning exercises to get our grounding. So things like promiscuous pairing and swapping pairs and timed pairs and all right, ping pong pairing, all those things I think, that were learning exercises that ultimately weren't supposed to become some enforced orthodox form of pairing, but really just, like a workout, like a pair programming workout, getting the muscle memory. So I think of it more, I think in the best case, mobbing or ensemble or collaborative or collective or whatever words we're going to use should be on an as needed basis. Like we should be able to assemble and disassemble the ensemble as needed. Like a transformer. Sometimes you're like the transformer made up of every person on the team, and sometimes you're just Bumblebee out on your own, able to transition into different phases. I think it's when we put these orthodoxies into place, especially with mobbing, because I think mobbing is an extension of the stuff we've already done, an extension of pairing. And when we do things that represent it in a way that you can sort of, in that example that I gave you guys of the really orthodox form of mobbing, where you've got a bunch of people watching and literally one person on the keyboard who's being dictated to what to do. I watched people in that group, in that team, rolling their eyes. I saw people disconnecting. Right? This is how we take a good, solid, meaningful practice, turn it into orthodox twaddle, and turn people off of it for the entirety of the rest of their careers. All for the sake of some grandiose methodology. I don't know what it's like. It's not even a methodology. It's almost like a liturgy.
So do you see these teams, do you see them, doing retrospectives or rotating people from the business in and out of these mobs? Because,
No.
I think, this sounds like an echo chamber that, and people are kind of being told how to work. And I think in general, the industry understands that self-organizing teams is a path to success. But I mean, you're right. There are these versions. Sorry?
Also failure.
Yeah. And so so failure and safety and experimentation, all these things are really maybe a basis for a good ensemble. And so I'm curious, for a team suffering from this sort of mobbing, what would you say to them to help them escape their situation? How if hopefully they're listening to the Mob Mentality Show, how would you tell them to get out of it?
Well, it's a difficult point. Like I would say to somebody in such a situation who has greater maturity, to if your gut is telling you, if you find yourself rolling your eyes, investigate that, examine it. But somebody with a lower maturity might just roll their eyes even at any good practice because it's something that's unfamiliar, and it's something that takes a lot more effort, and it's tiresome. So it would depend on who the audience is. I've saw good well-meaning brothers and sister programmers in the wild doing this forced style of orthodox mobbing ritual, and that's the word I was looking for earlier. It's just doing it ritualistically, being forced into these rituals and feeling bad for them, because I know that they know that this is a ritual. I know that they know that it's not really helping with the core issues, with the real problems that the team is having. And we're just going through the motions, and consultants are making hundreds of dollars an hour or thousands of dollars an hour for a consulting group. taking developers through these rituals. And the good people on the team who are really still active and committed to the vision and to the mission of the team, basically being sidelined, so that we can sort of, like slather over a layer of thick mob orthodoxy grease onto the team and sprinkle it with magic consulting dust and say that we're doing good work and we're making progress. It's a thing that's dependent on who the audience is. I would say one thing to somebody, as with anything, I would say one thing to a developer with great maturity and another thing to a developer who hasn't yet had the opportunity to develop that maturity.
Yeah,
it's heartbreaking though. Like, you see good people being crushed in the wheels of ritual, and people who ostensibly could be making serious contributions to the root causes of the problems of the organization, instead of doing this agile theater or agile theatrics. All I can do at the best of times is, hang my head and feel sympathy and try not to let them know that I'm feeling sad for them, because when you're contracting to a big consulting agency, you kind of gotta carry the message and toe the line to a great extent, without subverting everything. I'd want to subvert the whole thing, but
maybe as what would you suggest to an employer employing a consulting agency to help them identify if something below board is happening, right?
I don't know that there's anything that can be said. It's the same sort of question about maturity. If it's a developer, an employer that doesn't really have the tools to evaluate whether this is an actual good thing or just theatrics and smoke and mirrors. If they don't already know, then they're probably going out to get a consulting agency to help them. If they do know, they're probably not going out to get consultants to begin with. Like, they're probably the people to follow already, instead of being the followers. So I think it's a bit of a catch-22 that really can't be helped.
But it sounds like maybe there are those different styles, right? So those that know and maybe are leading the way, and others that don't know. And so, like, what about, for example, suggesting community to everyone, right? So find other software leaders like yourself and just talk about the things that you're experiencing with them, because there's a lot to be learned from a peer group, right? So if you had a peer group, some of them are going down one way and some of them are going down the other way, and maybe they just talk about it and identify those things. So I think in my mind that could be pretty helpful.
Yeah, but inherent in what you're saying is the word if you had a peer group. That is the big issue with large enterprise software development teams who are kind of at the menial labor end of the software development job experience. The companies themselves aren't doing anything to level up maturity and engagement with software development as a career or as a field of interest or practice. And then, the result of that is developers are somewhat demotivated to see this as much more than a job, and don't engage in community. The vast majority of software developers have no engagement with community at all. The vast majority of software developers aren't listening to podcasts or reading articles or God forbid reading books or taking classes or going and finding teachers and mentors. So I don't know a good answer to that. It's just activism. Keep at it. Try to keep the conversation going. Trying to keep calling attention to some of the less desirable things that happen in the fat part of the software development bell curve.
Nice. Yeah, I could see that, and that's part of something we're a part of in the community, and I can really resonate with what you're saying. Before I did mob programming, I think I saw the same thing happen with practices like TDD, where the culture it was like command and control. You're forced to do it. You don't understand what you're doing. You're just going through mechanics, and then it produced pretty bad stuff in the culture and for and the results in the code and that kind of thing. And I think that was one thing that
isn't that the worst thing? Like I'm sorry, TDD is one of the most effective exercises in implementing software design while also respecting fundamental practices, patterns, and principles. And if you don't come into it from that perspective of principles, and it's just forced on you, it's kind of like, forcing young children who have no engagement with reading to read Shakespeare in, grade school. Well, some of the result of that is some of those people will never be interested in reading again for the rest of their lives. What happens when we do this with TDD, when we force people to engage in this like TDD theatrics? They'll just say this was bogus and walk away from it and never reconsider it again.
Yeah.
That's just tragic. It's one of the most effective, beneficial practices I think that's come around in the last couple of decades. And we have just a ton of developers who had it forced upon them, who will never give it a second look again because it was forced.
Yeah. And I think I've seen the same thing with retrospectives. I heard you mention that too.
Oh, for sure.
And I think retrospectives done well, and maybe this problem scenario we're considering might help through the engagement problems this mob is experiencing, and might help some experimentation to happen. But we've also heard of retrospective theatrics, right? I forget who. I think it was the author of one of the retrospectives books was sharing how she observed a retrospective that was basically just a theater where one person kind of driving the stickies, and then no action was taken, and then it was over, kind of thing.
Yeah, no follow-up.
Yeah.
and everybody involved in those retrospectives knows it. I think one of the most important things, so in that case, there is a recommendation to any adopter, because retrospectives are much more obvious. TDD is very subtle. You have to understand, if you understand design principles, TDD will make a hell of a lot more sense. If you're interested in learning design principles, practicing deep TDD as the Mr. Miyagi wax on, wax off, muscle memory thing can get you to understand, or open up that field of design principles sooner or later. But that's real subtle. Retrospectives are pretty easy. You get a bunch of people in the room and tell them to do, same thing with stand-ups, by the way, tell them to follow a script. You can talk to those people and ask honestly, are retrospectives working? Which will force us to answer the question, what are retrospectives supposed to do? Which brings us down to things that are more, I think, grounded and rooted in lean methodologies rather than agile methodologies, which is the fundamental question: what problem does this solve? And if we can't identify a problem, that could just be that we're not seeing the problem, and that's fine. It's still valuable to do the exercise. But most of the time, I think people who are forced into retrospective rituals know that they're going through the ritual, know that they don't believe in it, and it causes them to disbelieve anything methodological or rigorous. Mm-hmm. So we harm, like, all the things that we wanted to accomplish with Agile, going back to 1999, are harmed by this enforcement of theater, Agile theater. At the same time, I also don't think that most teams have the freedom to give a damn about methodology, because their implementation is so troubled that the core problems that they're facing, even amongst interpersonal relationships, are rooted, ironically, as people persons would probably disagree with me, but most of the problems that a team has, aside from personality issues, are rooted in the code. All the strife that a team experiences is strife in dealing with their workplace, which our workplace is code, is the design, and without a mastery of design, we're bound to just continue to suffer through this strife. And retrospectives aren't helping with that. Retrospectives are basically acknowledging the symptoms or the symptomology of the problems inherent in the implementation without ever digging into the implementation. And you look at a methodology like Scrum. I remember, was it Scott Ambler a number of years ago tried to forward a capability, a maturity model CMM style maturity model for Agile, and he was torn to shreds for even suggesting such a thing, because at the time there was such a huge backlash of CMMI, the capabilities maturity model. But it was a useful thing to apply, and at that time, it basically was pretty straightforward to most people in Agile time. He slated Scrum at the lowest level of maturity. That obviously got a lot of backlash from a lot of people. But what is Scrum doing to help with this core problem, with the deeper problem that rests in the implementation and the obstruction to progress and continuity that the implementation itself is? Scrum cannot have answers for that. And it's not supposed to have answers for that, because it's really just very, very high level, loose, abstract project management, work management, team organization, and facilitation methodology. It almost has nothing to do. Like, the reason why Scrum can be applied to so many different industries is it has nothing specific to say about software, or nothing really to help software. If you have I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, I guess, here, but my saying to customers is always that if you have problems that Scrum solves, you have problems that Scrum can't solve. The problems are way deeper, and Scrum is basically moving the deck chairs on a Titanic unless you've got a very, very dysfunctional team, like personality wise, psychology wise. And at that point, it might be better to get an actual psychologist or performance coach rather than a Scrum facilitator. But those problems, all that strife, well, the inability for the team to make progress, that's all in basic fundamental knowledge of software design. And until that gap is closed, that strife continues. And there's that old funny poster that said that was the demotivators posters, the joke motivation posters. There's one about consulting. If you can't be part of the solution, there's money to be made in prolonging the problem. I think that's pretty much, with all due respect to my friends and colleagues who are in that consulting game, I think that's just the sham part of Agile consulting, specifically with Scrum consulting. It doesn't solve problems. It doesn't solve the deeper problems. It's trying to chase after symptoms. We do things that have no follow-up, no follow-through. We do things unscientifically and unmethodologically. And mostly what it does is drain the development budget and transfer wealth and value to consulting agencies that don't really have to deliver much of anything. When you're brought in to deliver retrospectives, like, what is your deliverable? I mean, that's a really great, that job itself is a perk. That's a job that doesn't have to deliver much of anything. And I can understand why people want that job, but it doesn't help. It doesn't solve the deeper problems. And I don't think any of it does. Retrospectives don't. Self-organizing teams may or may not. Every single practice, test-driven development is probably the only thing that I think gets close to solving root causes, because it is about structural design. And the problem with it is that word test, right? This has gone back 20 years. The problem with test-driven development has got the word test in it. And it doesn't really express to the users and to the adopters what you really need to be doing. And it has very little to do with unit testing, even though unit testing is the lowest bar, the lowest qualification you need to start practicing it.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so I mean, I think we hit on some of kind of the deeper cultural experimentation and freedom versus forced and all that kind of stuff that you saw with mob programming and other practices. And so maybe coming out of the dark side and maybe going to maybe the Luke Skywalker side of some of your experiences. So maybe we'll come back to retrospectives and TD and other things, but maybe starting with mob programming. I know you were sharing some
experience. Do it all the time.
Maybe was one with a UX designer or something like that, but maybe an example of where you saw it going well and what was different about it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I think first of all, I'm biased to think that ensemble work is categorically better. I can't say that it's provably better or quantifiably better, but through a couple decades of experience with it, it's categorically better in trying to achieve a certain thing. which has more to do with understanding perfection, leveraging perfection, making it a goal, and understanding that there's a methodology of it. Once we're over that line, mobbing makes a lot of sense, because making sure that everybody has a great degree of knowledge across the board, not just in their own workspace, not just in their own work area or area of operations, but in adjacent areas of operations, is all part of a virtuous system. So I can't but see mobbing or ensemble as anything. Like I couldn't come to another conclusion if my objective was very high performing software teams. But it can and should be anything from pairing all the way out to taking the entire team into a virtual room or a literal room with a projector and a screen, or through Zoom or Tuple or whatever you're using, and putting everybody's attention on the same thing. Every problem in software development comes from not having an understanding of what the mistakes are. And we are at a massive knowledge deficit in the industry in grappling with that. So I think mobbing is just, it's not magic. It's just make sure everybody has shared knowledge, not universally, but leveraging things like the notion of T people, understanding your upstream and downstream, facilitating handoffs, understanding value stream analysis and how that applies to this. Mobbing is the right solution to that. Mobbing is the right solution to harnessing the collective intellect when the collective intellect is necessary. Mobbing is the right solution to instituting new norms and practices and policies all at once, synchronously. It's just hard to beat, and all the way down to pairing. It really, like, I imagine myself imagine myself trying to sell this to somebody who's not on the same page, and I think it's impossible. All I can say is it's the right stuff, as long as it's enlisted in a virtuous system of dozens of other practices and awarenesses that work together with it. But the moment it's just, go ahead and do this, go through the motions, it's going to cause more harm than necessary. So we do mobbing of every scale, whole team, all the way down to pairing and across functions. So the notion that you talked about with pairing with UI designers, we recognize a problem, mostly reinforced through an understanding of lean, that handoffs are a huge problem. Delays in handoffs are a huge problem. Batching and queuing is the subject matter of a lean conversation, not so much an agile conversation. But we understand that, because we understand that the loss of fidelity of knowledge between people leads to a lot of rework, leads to a lot of slowdown, leads to a lot more of this strife, leads to mistakes being embedded into the software or calcified into the software in a way that cannot be fixed if it takes too long to remediate them. So all of that stuff is about immediate remediation rather than delayed remediation. So we recognize we had a traditional organization. Well, we had an organization that I would call traditional when it came to the handoff between the UI design organization and the rest of the organization. And I think that's a persistent problem in the industry right now, where UI design has kind of made a little enclave for itself, siloed itself. I think that the UI business is still pretty much, relative to software, very, very primitive industrially and methodologically and process-wise. It's a very young industry and hasn't really paid attention at all to the procedural and process matters. So coming to design folks and saying, hey, you guys are working in isolation. We need to stop that, and here's why. It requires you to tutor an entire industry on process and catch them up on process. At the same time as saying to them, your number one job perk, keeping your hands clean of all the dirty work, we're going to take that away from you. You're not going to work in a in an isolated office that's got a higher furniture and interior design budget and fashion budget than everybody else in the organization. That's a real tough sell. And it's a serious perk. Like working in isolation is a perk. Working without having to mob is a job perk. Like not being bothered, that's a perk. And that's, I think, where the design industry is now. So we use ensemble, pairing, mobbing, what have you, to bring in designers into the process and eliminate the starkness of the handoff by one, requiring developers to have a much deeper understanding of design and usability and customer, and two, requiring designers to understand how to implement their vision beyond doing mock-ups and things like Figma. That's probably one of the biggest optimizations any organization can do, is continue following that trend that Toyota and Lean has shown us of cross-functionality and people and leveraging it to economic advantage and value creation advantage. And mobbing is just great for that. Mobbing is great for socializing, for creating people at all, or pairing or collaborative or ensemble or whatever the hell we're going to call it. If you want to create people in your organization, first address the process so there isn't a the proverbial wall that we throw things over. And one of the side effects of this, tangible side effects of this, we realized. So Mary Poppendieck said something at a talk that I saw in 2004, which was a light bulb moment for me, which was, she said that the problem with giving one person the 8-hour-a-day job of being the requirements analyst is they'll produce requirements 8 hours a day, every day, irrespective of whether or not further elaboration on requirements was ever required. Which is why we got the proverbial 500-page requirements brick of a document. Why do we have that? Because we took one person, we specialized them, we isolated them and said, produce this, you're a machine, produce this output, make this part 8 hours a day. What do you end up with? Piles and piles and piles of unused inventory. In design right now, because design is pursuing this team structure where designers can be isolated because we see them as different kind of people, different kind of aesthetics and different kind of work life expectations. It produces design all day long, whether or not it's needed. And there's no pull system. Between design and development, it's a push system. And we already know the problems of push systems. And if we don't, they're documented, you can find out. Just reading the goal is a way to do that. I think reading the Phoenix Project is less so because it doesn't really talk that much, even though it's, those books are related. But reading the goal and understanding what push systems do and what work cells, what the problem that is created by work cells that are working autonomously without any connection to downstream and demand. What we found is exactly what we expected to find. The design function of our business was producing far more design than implementation could ever turn into value producing software. When we integrated these, I'm not gonna even say integrate, when we just put a pull system and people and destroyed the handoff and the barriers, we were able to go through the design system and eliminate one hell of a lot of waste and unused, unnecessary design elaboration.
Yeah.
That in and of itself is the net positive, but also the designers who can make that tradition become so much more well-grounded and become so much better tuned to learning exactly how much design needs to be, how much UI design needs to be produced without guessing at it, without just presuming what the producer of the 500-page requirements document in 2001 was doing, which is produce as much as possible and everybody, and produce as much produce as much work product as possible, and the developers will figure it out.
Yeah.
It's ludicrous, but that's what we get with isolation. And just to go back to the top, ensemble work, as long as it's supported by other supporting virtuous practice in a virtuous practice system, is one of the most powerful ways to take these isolated work cells and de-isolate them.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen the same thing. You know, we do it fairly often now. Maybe it's just nature work we're doing, but we'll mob with a UX UI designer, and it's just phenomenal. We learn so much from them, like
Right.
from you know, like UX, like how to make, you know, understand the user, understand the personas, and think more clearly about the problem and the software. And then they learn from us. I think he's starting to pick up unit testing a little bit because we're showing him how he could do it, and then so it's yeah, it's been fun. And I hear you you know, getting to kind of the lean, pursuing perfection, and kind of the lean mindset, and I love it. And I want to get there maybe as our last topic, but I had one more question on mobbing before we jump to that. Is so you kind of gave us kind of the you know, the fly in the back of the room example of kind of the mobbing that wasn't going so well, right? You know, you had low level navigation, you had people rolling their eyes and disengaged. You know, what's kind of your observation in a mob that's going well? Like, what's the kind of the A versus B example in your experience?
Oh boy. I mean, it becomes so natural that it's not noticed. There's nothing forced about it. Like in a forced mobbing situation, probably the most senior people understand that it's theatrics and you know, go through the motions because they're required to do it, and they'll throw it away, and they won't really re-engage with it meaningfully again. That's the forced thing. When you do mobbing and it just seems natural, like you can assemble, you can convene, and you can commission and decommission a mob within a span of a few seconds, ad hoc. You know, basically using the right tool for the right problem at the right time. And if that's the mob, you can assemble a mob and disassemble a mob. It just becomes so natural that you don't even think of it. Like we don't even address it by a name. We don't really say, and now we're switching to mob mode. It's just now there's a need for somebody else to cross-check me on what we're doing. And that's the thing I think that pair programming trained us to do. I think it's the thing that extreme programming trained us to do, is to understand that we are human machines, and we do have the problem with the human machine is it's capable of producing faults, and it's good to have our biases checked. And if we can acknowledge that we make mistakes, and we're bound to make mistakes, and if we can acknowledge the real cost of mistakes in terms of sending the design down directions that we may never be able to recover from, then avoiding mistakes in design becomes a priority, or not a priority, becomes the priority, and the unassailable priority, which, you know, leads to the thing about perfection. And when you're doing that, everything else that you need to do to make that happen just flows. It just becomes natural. So I think in the best case mobbing, you don't even know you're doing it. It's just a tool you reach for. You know, my favorite saying is specific countermeasures for specific circumstances. You've got a great big toolkit of all the practices, and you don't just throw them. You don't just use them every day and every moment. You know exactly which technique from Agile to use in exactly which moment. And you don't just pre-schedule them. Like on Fridays, we will have retrospectives, as opposed to when we recognize that there's a problem looming and building up, we're going to stop the line and we're going to address it in an ensemble fashion. We don't even call that a retrospective anymore. It just becomes problem solving. And when the team becomes focused on problem solving, because they've learned what the problems really are, the deeper, darker, more hidden, invisible problems become more visible and more tangible. Everything required to solve those problems just becomes flow, and nobody has any reticence or resistance to doing it, because we're all aligned along the same understanding of what mistakes do to software. I think that's the biggest problem of all. We're at a point in the history of software where, you know, it's still pretty primitive. We're using high tech, but it's still pretty primitive. The way we use the high tech is really primitive. And by and large, the vastest majority of people who work in software don't know what a mistake is in software design. And we make them, we entrench them, encase them, and encapsulate them, and calcify them in ways that we can't fix them. And we move merrily along the way because we never even saw these mistakes. We never even saw, we don't have a microscope powerful enough to see into the cellular and molecular level of software design, which is where all the problems are created. We don't stop the cancer when it's at its first signs, because we think that's too small to matter. It's just the old problem, the old analogy with Louis Pasteur and Semmelweis before medical science or physical science recognized this thing called germs. We couldn't even believe them, right? Physicians wouldn't even accept the reality of their existence. You were laughed out of the room if you suggested there was these things that are causing toxicity and they're invisible. Now, of course, we know. But there was a time where that was you literally laughed out of the room. But it's a factor of the evolution of the understanding of human science, which is recognizing that there are things that we presently do not have a fine enough optics to visualize that are in fact the biggest cause of the most pervasive problems. And the answer to that is refining and exercising our optics so that we can see those things.
I think a lot of it has to do also, because I think we do have these tools, and if you've got a lot of really senior people that have a lot of XP, design pattern, unit testing, et cetera, they can instantly
put it all together.
So yeah, I mean, they can be like, oh yeah, this is the problem. We don't have a common facade across multiple concepts, and now you've hosed all your ability to expand the product in the future. But I think one big thing, and one reason that Ensemble helps a lot, is that we can't teach these concepts fast enough as people come into the industry, right? And so
absolutely.
Yeah, you're and then also even the team dynamic stuff that you're talking about, and having good retrospectives versus bad. I think a lot of the time we just have one or two really senior people and a whole bunch of junior level people, and there's like an anti-pattern of saying, oh hey, you junior level person, just go off and do this thing that's not
go off on your own.
Yeah. And so you don't slow me down, and what ends up happening is it the side effects of that are profound, really. And so then you get a lot of these like same behaviors over and over again, and ensemble programming will instead just share enough knowledge, and this person can kind of learn through osmosis, and now all of a sudden you have somebody that remembers that one time that we did that thing, that now I can make that common facade and I make a better design choice. And so I think a lot of the stuff that we face in the industry is due to like bad decisions around high levels of turnover. And so
yeah, that's fascinating. What's the cause of the turnover?
It's just the expansion of the industry. Like, so I feel like the software industry in general is an insatiable machine, right? And so more and more people every year go into school for software development. More and more people get into senior roles, and then they get poached from company to company. And a lot of this might just be like based in economics in general. And so I think a lot of software leaders need to view the industry as just an ever-changing thing. I actually don't, people happy with their job will stay at their job, like probably up until like maybe a 20% pay increase. But the thing is that, if you land a stable job, you really love it. And then there's another company that just received VC funding, and then all of a sudden they're offering, 40, 50% increases to people, then they're out of there. So, I think one thing that I felt like over the last, 5 years, I've been thinking a lot about is this idea that it's like, how do you make your team just really resilient to turnover? And because a lot of these problems that you're describing here, I feel like are introduced that way, and people want to get better, but on average for the industry, they only stay together for 2 years. And I feel like those really high performing teams that we talk about end up being, together as a full team with the same group of people for no more than 2 years. And more often they're shifting faster than that. And so,
that reminds me of Toyota, the average span of work, the average career at Toyota is decades,
Yep.
not not years. So why do people stay? Why do software developers, you know that old saying, like, people don't quit jobs, they quit bosses?
Yeah.
I think in software development, it's not that. I think it's not that people quit jobs, they quit code bases.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's just it. You know, software developers get burned out on the mess. We get burned out on the mess we ourselves created, and then we ourselves didn't invest the time, energy to fix. And so we do this ridiculous thing where we think, well, maybe I'll just move on, you know, and there is another code base somewhere else there isn't. I mean, well, there is. There are actually, you know, I think software development shops that are already, you know, I actually kind of think of it as the same analogy in manufacturing. When lean swept through manufacturing, there were, you know, lean shops and, you know, and ones who hadn't got there yet. There still are. But, you know, that hasn't happened yet in software. Like, we haven't hit our 1980s, that manufacturing experience, the experience that manufacturing had in 1980s. So there is no reason to leave. Like, you're not going to find something else. So we do things like saying, well, you know, it's going to be shitty everywhere. So sorry, pardon my French. It's going to be bad everywhere. So why don't I go work at the same badness for, you know, 50% more to 100% more of the money. And the reality is, like, it's all us. Like, it's all on our hands to make this better.
Craftsmanship is important, and we need a good way to learn it quickly, and we need to resolve our interpersonal problems quickly so that we can find flow quickly.
Yeah.
And
how many interpersonal problems come out of two developers basically having combat over an approach to a piece of software, of an approach to doing something in software that really, most of the times, if you examined it from the perspective of design principles, you might find out that both approaches are completely wrong.
Yeah.
Or you'd end up with a clearer answer. Like, there is a way to adjudicate objectively approaches to software development, and to see what mistakes are and what to avoid, and to see the existing mistakes in our implementations and even our tooling. And that's just simply by understanding software principles, which would take me down the path of, and who the hell can understand software principles given the vocabulary that it's presently expressed in? Like, solid principles is a revelation. As long as you've been enlisted into the inner circle of, you know, 27th level masonry masters who've been given the secret code to decipher what, you know, all the descriptions of software principles are. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
Well,
and from so many different guns, it's tragic.
As a community, we're trying to solve that problem, and so I wish we could continue this conversation longer, but
we're done.
We've hit our time box, and so I just wanted to know: is there anything that you wanted to plug or share before we close out the show?
No, I think it would be inappropriate to turn stuff into self-promotion. You know, it would be
after the aforementioned conversation.
Yeah, I got lots of stuff I'd love to plug, but nah, you know, people are interested, they can find out through the powerful search engines that we have at our disposal.
All right.
But,
well,
yeah, this is good. I appreciate it.
There will be links in the show notes. So, to all of our viewers out there, if you find yourself kind of in a mundane mob or an ensemble with an existential crisis, then maybe you forward this episode to them and share it. And you know, with that, be sure to like, subscribe, tell your friends, and we'll see you all next time. And Scott, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on ensemble programming.
Yeah, Chris and Austin, thanks for the conversation. It was nice.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Cheers.